2025 begins, 6 months since Keir Starmer took charge. Who'd have imagined back in July that the Prime Minister with all that power would be under repeated attack from the world's richest man? Elon Musk's barbs online vie with huge problems in real life, in the NHS and beyond. We'll hear from Musk's pal, Nigel Farage, whose political party, Reform UK, seems to be growing in strength every day. But here live with us in the studio in our first show of the year, the Health Secretary Wes Streeting, talking about his big plans for the NHS, and the Shadow Home Secretary Philp. Welcome to you both. Got to do this for a New Year's resolution from you both. Wes Streeting, what's yours?
Well, obviously cut NHS waiting lists, but also I had 1 or 2 mince pies, too many over Christmas. So I think, like many people, be thinking about getting back in shape, or maybe more in rather than back in shape.
Health Secretary's on a diet,
yeah, absolutely. I think I've got to practice what I preach on public health. See how we get on. Ask me in December. All
right, Philp, what about you?
Well, I think, personally, I want to do a lot more exercise. Maybe, Wes, we should start working out together.
Oh my!
Westminster, who knows? There's an offer for you. And also, I want to spend less time on my mobile phone, which is very, very addictive. Yeah, but look, politically, I think just taking the fight to Labour and holding them to account for the litany of lies and broken promises they have left trailing in their wake following the election campaign.
I thought we were going to start off with a friendly note at the beginning of the year, but it
was friendly to start with.
Just a big bout of hypocrisy to start the year.
Goodness
Happy
me.
New Year, Chris.
All right,
really good to see you.
Settle down. All right, well, more from both of you later in the programme, as well as Nigel Farage. So what was his New Year's resolution?
Now, I have said that I'm going to do dry January. But I tell you what, if I get past the inauguration in Washington, that would be a miracle.
And morning, and a warm welcome to you and to 2025. My team at the desk for our first show of the year: Nicola Ranger, the new boss of the Nurses Union, the RCN; Samuel Kasumu, former Conservative number 10 advisor; and Ellen Johnson, former Labour Minister, Health Home Secretary, and all sorts of things. A warm welcome to my trio for today. Let's start with what is making the news this morning. Well, here at the BBC, we're leading with snow in January because there's disruption all over the country. Plenty of weather warnings in place. This is snowy Leeds. We can show you what's been happening at Gatwick and at Stansted Airport too. And this morning, Manchester, Liverpool and Leeds Bradford Airport have all closed runways. And we'll update you on what's going on with all of that at the end of the show. But the papers are a pick and mix today. The Independent on Sunday splashes on the costs of Brexit. The Sunday Times lead is about holes in Britain's defences, and it picks up on Wes Streeting's plans for the NHS, we'll talk about later. The Express predicts thousands of extra deaths because of delays in A&E. And the Mail front page features another bad opinion poll for Keir Starmer. Happy 6-month anniversary, they may as well say. Let's start, though, with the three of you. Something really strange has been happening in the last few days, Alan. We've seen repeated attacks by Elon Musk, the world's richest man, political pal of Donald Trump and Nigel Farage, attacking, in quite inflammatory terms, the Prime Minister and the Labour government over what some people see as inaction over the grooming scandal. What do you make of what he's up to, and what should Labour do about it?
It's Orwellian. That's what it is. I mean, I know George Orwell spoke about 1984, so we're 40 years late to this. But in 1984, you remember slavery is freedom, ignorance is strength. I mean, there seems to be a lot of ignorance in this. We've had a public inquiry into grooming. It took 7 years. It cost 200 million. Why is the Leader of the Opposition calling for a public inquiry when she was in Cabinet, when they made 20 recommendations, none of which have been acted upon? It's a bizarre, strange world. And I would think what Musk is proving is that having lots of money doesn't make you more intelligent about world affairs. It's a strange situation.
And we'll pick up on the calls for an inquiry with Wes Streeting and Philp a bit later. But Samuel, you've seen also Conservatives seem sometimes to follow Reform, who've been following Elon Musk. I mean, what do you think of this sort of ecosystem in a way? It's all feeding off each other. Is it a concern of yours?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Elon Musk is the richest man in the world. He has one of the largest platforms in the world that he owns, and it can be dangerous in many respects if it's used to amplify dis and misinformation. I think that the challenge is whether or not politicians will rise to how you combat Elon Musk. And Nigel Farage, in what he has done recently around his response to Tony Robinson's messaging being amplified by Elon Musk, I thought was quite strong. I think Labour probably don't quite have a fully formulated plan around how they respond to Elon Musk, but I don't think the Conservatives do either. I think the challenge for Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives is how can you get to a point by the time we get to the next election where it feels like it's Kemi versus Keir, because right now it feels like it's Kemi versus Farage, Nigel Farage, and that's not helping her.
And we'll hear from him in a few moments, but we're also going to talk a lot today about the NHS. And of course, the government is publishing lots of new plans for the NHS in England. But Nicola, give us a glimpse of what's happening right now in wards and corridors often around the country.
Yes, thank you. It is extremely difficult, and it's a very challenging winter, particularly with flu. 5,000 cases a day. So flu and the other viruses are causing a real challenge. This is particularly difficult this winter, though, because wards and departments are already escalated into inappropriate areas all through the summer. So June, July, August, all through the year, we've seen patients in corridors, both in A&E and in wards. So therefore, it's made it extremely difficult with an added clinical operational pressure because there's nowhere to go. So it's extremely difficult at the moment.
OK, we'll pick up with Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, on that a bit later in the programme. But let's focus then on Nigel Farage and reform, because since bagging a handful of MPs in the election, the party now says it's bigger than the Conservatives, hitting, they say, yesterday, more than 170,000 members. Both Tory and the Labour Party are nervous about what Mr Farage is doing and why he seems to be pulling in so much support. As we've been talking about, in recent days, he's repeatedly attacked the government over what's become known as the grooming gang scandal, dreadful abuse of young girls by groups of men of mainly Pakistani origin that the authorities did little about, sometimes ignored, before investigations and some inquiries in recent years. But Farage has been packing venues around the country, like at the racetrack in Chelmsford in Essex yesterday, where I spoke to him and some of those giving up their weekend to listen to his speech.
The Reform Party is a breath of fresh air, quite frankly.
Why'd you say that?
Because they're saying what the people want to hear. That's what we want. We want to move on. We want progression. We want more finances coming into this country.
I feel angry. I'm feeling emotionally angry. Actually trying to talk to you and keep my composure.
He absolutely speaks for how a lot of people feel at the moment, you know, and I don't think there's anyone else that is doing that.
It's Nigel Farage for now. Arguably, it's already got broader than that. I think certainly by 2029, this will be, as he says, a political revolution.
Well, then we sat down with Mr Farage himself. Some of the people here we've spoken to this afternoon, though, seem to be coming to you because they're very angry. They're very angry about the state of the country. Do you think that's what it's about?
As they should be. As they should be. You know, the reopening of the debate around the, well, they call it the grooming gang scandal, but it's not. It's the mass rape scandal. I just think people ask themselves, what has happened to our country? How could this possibly have happened? Why did everybody want to cover it up? Why has there been no full public inquiry? People are angry about that, yes, and they're right to be. Absolutely right to be. They're also angry economically. We are getting poorer. You know, if you look at the last 8 quarters, GDP per capita is falling in 6 of them. And it coincides with a period of record net legal migration. Mass immigration not only makes it tough for young people to get a house, not only makes it very difficult to see a GP, not only makes our roads and infrastructure struggle to cope, it's making us poorer. And I think the anger isn't directed at the Labour or Conservative parties. I think people increasingly regard them as a uni party. So you're right, they're coming to us because they're angry, but they're not coming to us to stick 2 fingers up to the establishment. They're coming to us because they think we've got the courage to do what's necessary to turn this around.
But what do you plan to do with that? I mean, what's your dream scenario for 2025?
2025, it's to build the structure of the party, you know. And since really August of last year, we've tried with nothing to build branch structure. to put in place a very rigorous, and I mean extremely rigorous, vetting procedure for candidates at all levels, because that was the big failing, you know, of what we had at the last election. Huge failing, no question about that. 2025 was about getting that machine actually working to start to win some victories. Our ultimate goal, and I'm not joking, is to win the next general election.
You say you've done it with nothing. You have had a very useful thing, the support and the oxygen of the support from someone who's on his way back to the White House, and Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, who just happens to also own one of the biggest social media platforms in the world. Now, you mentioned there people's anger over the grooming scandal, as it's known, and it is well understood now that there were failings over many, many years. There's no question about that. Everybody understands that that has taken place, and nobody would excuse what has happened for a second. However, your political friend, Elon Musk, has made pretty outlandish claims about exactly what happened there. And he wrote online that the Prime Minister was complicit in the rape of Britain. Is it acceptable for the world's richest man, with a friend on his way back to the White House, to spread those kinds of misleading and what many people would think are pretty offensive claims online?
Well, you either believe in free speech or you don't. Now, free speech has its limits, obviously, incitement being perhaps the clearest example of what's not acceptable. Remember, before Musk came along and bought Twitter, free speech was dying on social media. And if you criticised the lockdowns that were happening in this country, your accounts were being suspended. So Musk describes himself as a free speech absolutist. Now, you know, what he's referring to there specifically is that in 2008, Keir Starmer had just been appointed as Director of Public Prosecutions, and there was a case brought before them of alleged mass rape of young girls that did not lead to a prosecution. I don't know the rights and wrongs of that any more than you do.
But the point,
but if you believe in free speech, people are allowed to have an opinion.
But as you just said, free speech does not have a completely unlimited bind.
No.
Is it acceptable? So I'll just ask this again, because Elon Musk seems to be very busy making these kinds of very, very, very provocative claims about British politicians. He said Keir Starmer was complicit in the rape of Britain. He said that Jess Phillips, who's a government minister who's worked her whole career helping victims of abuse, he said that she was a rape genocide apologist. This afternoon he said that she's a wicked witch, that she is pure evil. Is it acceptable for somebody with Elon Musk's platform to say those kinds of things?
I tell you what, you know, those on the left have thrown these sort of jibes at the right for many, many decades, and will go on doing so.
But I'm asking you about the specific thing. Is that acceptable?
If it turns out, and I'm going to caveat this, if it turns out that Keir Starmer, as Director of Public Prosecutions, did, in effect, not prosecute a case for fear of what it would do to community relations, for fear that it would provoke the charge of racism, well, if that's the case, then he is open to be criticised. And we all criticise in our own way. Doesn't mean that I would... And by the way, the fact that Musk supports me and supports reform doesn't mean, as two grown-ups, we have to agree with everything the other says.
But the evidence actually from Keir Starmer's time at the Crown Prosecution Service was actually he put in place specialist prosecutors to deal with this kinds of problem. He did prosecute many cases like this. Now, as we've discussed, nobody would deny that many vulnerable girls were appallingly let down by people across the piece. But my question to you again is, I think, as a senior politician, as somebody who wants to get to number 10...
I really don't think let down is an acceptable way of putting this. I mean, it's as if, oh, well, it's all a little bit of a pity. No, what happened was absolutely, truly be awful in a way that we ought to be actually ashamed of in every way.
But the question here that I'm asking you is not about what happened in the grooming scandal. As you rightly say, everybody will agree that it was appalling. The truth about that came out over a period of many years. But is it...
Drip feed, drip feed, drip feed. No big, full national public inquiry. Jess Phillips has denied that. The Conservative administration before equally denied that.
But the question that I'm...
And by the way, our American friends, and Musk is one of them, look at what's happened with utter disbelief.
But there is a difference, is there not, between expressing a view and circulating claims to millions of people with a megaphone that Musk has that are misleading and offensive, saying that somebody was complicit in the rape of the country. And
I don't know the truth of what happened in 2008. Let's find out.
So you think it's acceptable for somebody to say that the British Prime Minister was complicit in the rape of the country?
I believe in free speech, even if what people say is offensive. If you find it offensive, if most people find it offensive, would I rather live in a world where we're free to cause offence than a world in which free speech and debate get shut down? I know which of those two I prefer.
But would you tell Elon Musk that he is wrong? So I know you've distanced yourself from his comments about Tommy Robinson.
Do you know what? Real friends, when they meet face to face, have conversations, and they agree to agree, and sometimes they agree to disagree. And that is what open society and free speech is all about.
But have you or anyone in your team said to Elon Musk that his calls for Tommy Robinson to be released from prison, a convicted offender, somebody on the far right who you yourself work very hard to distance yourself from, have you told him that he's wrong about that?
I think you're missing the point. The point is the fact that he supports me politically and supports reform doesn't mean I have to agree with every single statement he makes on X. And I think you're getting bogged down in this. I will, at the inauguration, have a conversation with him on a variety of things. This will no doubt be one of them. But I think the media are getting too hung up on this. Frankly, what he says about other people, what his views on electric vehicles are, or whatever it may be, isn't relevant.
But I suppose what I'm asking you about is whether you, and I know you're somebody who cares about politicians' safety, for example, you and I have discussed that before. Yeah. You've been the target of abuse yourself on many occasions. It's a straightforward question. Do you think it's acceptable for a government minister to be accused of being a rape genocide supporter, being called pure evil, and by the elected Prime Minister of this country to be accused of being complicit in rape?
These are very, very tough terms. If you believe they're insightful, if you do believe they're insightful, then they go beyond the line.
But do you think they've gone beyond the line?
In public life, tough things get said. They get said by both sides of the debate. You're right, this man happens to be the richest man in the world. But equally, the fact that he's bought Twitter now actually gives us a place where we can have a proper open debate about many things. And hey, even Facebook, even Meta are adjusting to the modern world. Free speech is back. We may find it offensive, but it's a good thing, not a bad thing.
You can tell that many in not just the British government, but in other governments around the world are sort of holding their breath to see what your other American friend, Donald Trump, is going to do when he gets back to the White House. I just wonder, what conversations have you had with him since he won the election? And I suppose, how do you think he will approach the UK?
So, two things to say. Number one, he's prepared for it this time. I can tell you the whole mood at Mar-a-Lago for the last 18 months has been a much more organised, disciplined one, and planning for the future. He's got up to 3,000 appointments he can make as president. They've been working on this for over a year. So he goes in with a professional team. He goes in with a new sense of calm about himself and the way that he conducts himself. And I particularly think since the assassination attempts, he's become a much calmer person. He has got a plan, and it's quite a radical plan. He will, on the world stage, do what he did in the first term and try and bring peace. This is the guy that oversaw the Abraham Accords. This is the guy that crossed the line and walked into North Korea. The Ukraine war will end. It will end. Even Zelensky now, the Ukrainian president, says, yes, it will end. As far as we're concerned, this may be the last ever American president with a deep emotional attachment to these islands. And so, yes, he of course is talking about tariffs, which is one example of something that could happen that could really hurt us. It's all avoidable. It's all avoidable.
If?
Well, I think we have to think, I think Starmer has to think about two things very hard. Firstly, does he want us to be tied ever closer to a failing Europe or tied to a booming America? And secondly, I think the one thing Keir Starmer needs to really think about is this. We're the biggest foreign investor in America. They're the biggest foreign investor here. Trade is important. Our cultural ties are deeper today than they ever have been at any point in history.
How would you describe your, some people call it a bromance, with Trump and Musk?
I made a decision in 2016 to put my head over the parapet to support Trump. I have stuck with him through thick and thin. At times it's not been easy. Maybe at times I was the only public figure in Britain that would stand up for him. And Trump is an old school businessman in the sense that if you're loyal to him, he's loyal to you. And that's what friendships are based on.
And is his friend, Elon Musk, now your friend? And is he going to give you millions of pounds?
Well, that's a real question, isn't it? Now, forget about the $100 million being talked about in the newspapers.
Are you going to give you money?
That is for the birds.
Is he going to give you money?
He may well do. He may well do. But it's got to be legal. He's got to be comfortable with it. He may well give us money. Whether he does or not, I'll tell you what he gives us. With huge numbers of young people, he makes us look cool.
Is the reason you hope he's going to give you money, is that why you don't want to criticise him?
I think I've made it perfectly clear that I don't agree with everything he stands for, but I do believe in free speech. I think he's a hero, and I said that well before any potential money was offered.
Nigel Farage, thank you very much. Thank you for speaking to us. Thank you. Well, next week we are hoping to speak to Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader, and through the rest of the month, the Prime Minister and Ed Davey should, in theory, be joining us too. But we begin the year not in a normal situation. Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, who's on Team Trump, has been busy posting inflammatory messages on his social media platform, saying the Prime Minister should face charges and a government minister should be in jail for not going ahead with a new national inquiry into the grooming gang scandal that we talked about. It's important to remember when Keir Starmer was boss of the Crown Prosecution Service, he presided over prosecutions of some of those gangs. So it is a long and an important story to understand. But Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary for England, is with us today, and we will talk about your plans for the NHS. But let's start with this, because it is not a normal situation. Given how far Elon Musk has been going in his attacks on Keir Starmer, in this post, for example, accusing the Prime Minister of being complicit in what he calls the rape of Britain. This is not mild criticism. Can you work with this man, as you suggested you still could a few days ago?
Well, actually, what I was saying the other day is that if he wants to roll his sleeves up and actually do something about tackling violence against women and girls, then online platforms, whether X or any of the other platforms, have got a role to play in keeping people safe online, helping law enforcement clamp down on perpetrators of violence against women and girls and people who want to groom kids online. Keir Starmer and Jess Phillips, by the way, who've both been on the receiving end of completely ill-judged and ill-founded criticism, are people who have done, in their professional lives, more than most people ever do to lock up paedophiles, rapists, wife-beaters and every other kind of scumbag in our society. As Director of Prosecutions, Keir Starmer opened up historic cases going after people who thought they'd gotten away with it. He put in place specialist prosecutors to make sure that we could build the evidence to put rapists behind bars. And as for Jess, the work that she has done in her professional life outside politics, supporting victims of violence against women and of girls, has helped to support them to get their day in court and to lock up their abusers. So the fact they're now Prime Minister and Victims Minister means they can now do in politics what they've given their careers to doing, and their critics are not fit to touch their records. They've got records that their critics can't even begin to touch.
And yet this is what Elon Musk says about them, calling Jess Phillips a rape apologist, saying she's a wicked witch. What do you say to him? You just said critics aren't fit to touch them. Is Elon Musk not fit to touch or to talk about?
It is a disgraceful smear of a great woman who has spent her life supporting victims of the kind of violence that Elon Musk and others say that they're against. And it's all very well sitting there, and I'm not just talking about Musk, I'm talking about armchair critics on social media. It's all very easy to sit there and fire off something in haste and click send, when people like Keir Starmer and Jess Phillips have done the hard yards of actually locking up wife beaters, rapists, paedophiles.
So you say
those are good people with great records outside politics. The reason why Keir Starmer and Jess Phillips came into politics was they recognised that what they were doing, either in Keir's case through criminal justice or Jess's case through the voluntary sector supporting victims, could go so far. But politics, government, is a force for good in our society, and that's how you deliver real change for people. And it's great we've got a Prime Minister and a Victims Minister who are now able to do in government what they spent their professional lives seeking to tackle.
And you say it's a disgraceful smear. What then is the government actually going to do about this? Because Elon Musk does seem to have developed a specific habit of attacking your government with the huge megaphone that he has. What do you say to him? Stop it, back off, keep your nose out, or ignore it?
To be honest, the Prime Minister can talk about whether he wants to respond, but On the job that we're doing to tackle violence against women and girls, the best response to what I think, beyond the sort of the oxygen we give to individuals on social media, there are serious issues. The most important voices in all of this are victims of violence against women and girls and other sexual crimes.
He's an advisor
and that's
to the
that's the focus we've got to give, and that's the focus we are giving. The Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, the Victims Minister, they're focusing on tackling the problem, not talking about it.
And we'll talk about the NHS, which is hugely important in just a second, but I just want to be clear. Can Elon Musk just carry on doing this with impunity? I mean, this is not any old person. It's not even any old billionaire. He's an advisor to the man who's about to move into the White House. So what would your message be to him as someone who's part of the government, who's trying to take on these issues, as you've explained? Well,
he's got a big platform. He's got a big voice. So he can say what he likes. But what we're focused on is making sure we deliver justice, to make sure that we tackle violence against women and girls. And let's not forget, there was an independent inquiry in this country into grooming gangs, the Alexis J report. None of those recommendations were implemented, so we're getting on with doing that.
And we'll
there have
put
been
that
some
to the
very
Home
powerful
Secretary
reports.
shortly.
The Rotherham report, for example, called out not just the corruption locally, but also the extent to which fears of being accused of being racist or upsetting community cohesion were disrupting or intimidating people from coming forward. We've got no time for that. We want to deal with those problems too, and we will. But we will do that by delivering real change, not just by talking about it. And I think, to be honest, that there's been far too much time and attention given to what one person in another country has got to say. We're more interested in what victims in this country need us to do, working with victims to make sure that they get the justice they deserve and to make sure that other people don't find themselves being victims of the worst kinds of crimes in our society.
Well, let's talk then about your plans for the NHS. Now, you are trying to increase the choice for patients. You're making changes to the NHS app. But if you look at what's going on right now in the NHS, we've looked at the stats this week, show there are 3.5 times more people in hospital with flu. We've just heard from Nicola, the new boss of RCN, about how difficult things are right now. How worried are you about the current situation? Are we at the peak of what's going on with flu, for example?
Extremely, and I think we're likely to see the peak of flu sometime in the next week or two. It's still going up, and that is creating a real pressure on the NHS. I think my reflection, and I've spent quite a bit of time over Christmas visiting hospitals in Greater London, the southwest of England, South Yorkshire, the northwest of England, different hospitals in different parts of the country, looking at how they're coping and not coping, and starting to prepare right now, this winter, for next winter, because what we can't have, and where we've got to in the last 14 years, is a situation where winter pressures turn into annual winter crises. And I was honest coming into this winter, you can't just turn 14 years of failure around in 6 months. We did go in this winter without strikes nationally for the first time in 3 years. So you got doctors on front lines instead of picket lines. We did a big boost on vaccination, including the new RSV vaccine for the first time. The Chancellor unlocked funding during this year, as well as the funding that's coming in through the budget from April. But it is going to take time to turn the NHS around. And that's why, not just in opposition, but in the last 6 months, and the Prime Minister saying more about this tomorrow in relation to waiting lists, we have banged the drum hard for the case that, yes, the NHS needs investment, but it also needs reform. Otherwise, we will not break this cycle of annual winter crises that we've seen come as regularly as the Coca-Cola van and the John Lewis ads.
But Nicola's told us this morning, even June and July, there are already people being treated in corridors. We've looked at the stats. I think there were 12,000 people being stuck waiting in ambulances for more than an hour before they could be seen in hospital. Isn't that what you should be focusing on,
Definitely,
rather than the long-term plans to make? I mean, some health leaders have said this week that with a grave concern is that your plans fail to recognise without emergency care recovery, your plan for electives, cutting the waiting list, will fail.
We've got to do both. You've got to focus on the immediate crisis and the longer term, and that's what we're doing. And, urgent emergency care is a really good example, actually. If I think about the pressures we're seeing in emergency departments right now, so many of the solutions to those pressures lie outside emergency departments. That's about fixing the front door to the NHS in general practice and making sure people have got care close to home and in the home. We've got a lot of ambulance call-outs at the moment, particularly to frail elderly people who could be supported and managed at home, but the care isn't there. We've got lots of people who are staying in emergency departments too long because they need an acute bed elsewhere in the hospital, but we can't discharge because of delays, because of a lack of care in the community. So that's why we're taking a systemic approach to solving these challenges, because if every single part of the NHS, primary care, community services, mental health, social care as well, all of these things have been run into the ground. Turning it around is going to take time. We've hit the ground running in the last 6 months, but of course there is so much more to do. And that's why this year you'll be hearing a lot more from the government about what we are doing, not just what we're saying, what we are doing to turn around what is objectively the worst crisis in the history of the NHS.
But particularly this weekend when temperatures are tumbling, the country's freezing, there's snow and disruption everywhere. Last week, the NHS told people to stay at home. You told pensioners, many of whom have lost their winter fuel payments, that they should turn the heating on and layer up. I mean, that raised some people's eyebrows. What do you say to people today? Well,
it'd be irresponsible of me not to repeat the health advice that the NHS has given people. And I would just say on the winter fuel allowance, let's not forget the Chancellor did protect winter fuel allowance for the poorest pensioners. She's kept in place measures like the warm homes discount so that people receiving support can turn on the heating over winter. And I know that not all of the decisions we've taken in the last 6 months have been popular. The reason why we've been prepared to take unpopular decisions is to get the country out of the massive hole we're in so that people see in the longer term we've made the right decisions to get Britain back on track. So obviously we're talking about the NHS this morning. You could have the Justice Secretary here and she'd be talking about overcrowded prisons and the courts backlog. The Education Secretary would talk about the lack of teachers in our school and kids turning up too hungry to learn. The Home Secretary would talk about the lack of neighbourhood policing to catch criminals. On every single front at the moment, on every single public service that matters, and of course for people at home, the pressure in their pockets, their wages, their bills, the country's left in a massive mess. So of course it's going to take time to turn around, and we have had to make some decisions that we know have been unpopular because we believe they're the right decisions. And let me tell you, people would not thank us down the line if we just did short-term sticking plaster politics, government by gimmick of the type we've seen for years now that have left our country worse off.
But in the last 6 months, you and your colleagues have sat in that red chair and said, we have to take difficult decisions, we have to take difficult decisions. You've spent ages telling how terrible things are. But the country's looked at what you're doing and thought, well, actually, that looks pretty terrible too. I mean, your poll ratings have really fallen away. What do you have to do a better job at? Explaining what you're doing? You haven't been explaining it well enough, maybe.
The only thing that really matters in the end is delivery. At the next election, people will be thinking, is the country better off now? We're in a better place now than we were when Labour came to power. And we're doing everything we can to make sure the answer to that question is an emphatic yes. We were honest before the election about the fact that change takes time, that the challenges are enormous. We were criticised, actually, with our manifesto because we were very clear about the promises we were making, so there were promises we could keep. You didn't tell anyone you were going to put employers' national insurance up. Do you have to do a better job of explaining why you're doing what you're doing this year? Well, that's one of the reasons I'm here this morning, and you'll see government ministers out on the airwaves throughout this year explaining the choices we're making, what we are doing, and over the course of this Parliament, the impact we're making, because ultimately that's the only thing that matters. And I know, for example, on health and social care, I know that people will be judging me on whether we deliver on the really ambitious target the Prime Minister set to get NHS waiting times from 18 months where they currently are to 18 weeks by the end of this Parliament. And that's why we're setting out the specific steps, not just the investment, but the reform to make the NHS easier and more convenient to use, to give patients more choice, to get rid of the waste and inefficiency we see in the NHS, like the fact there's about 1 million appointments a year where people are turning up, or not turning up, I should say, wasting appointments. But the NHS often writes them by post. The letters arrive after the appointment was due to take place. You book a table in a restaurant these days, or even an appointment at the hairdresser, you'll get a text message 24 or 48 hours in advance to remind you. Why doesn't the NHS do this? These are the practical steps we'll be taking. The Prime Minister will be setting out our plan tomorrow to cut NHS waiting times.
And everyone will hear more about that tomorrow.
And it's the results we're going to be judged on.
And everyone will hear more about that tomorrow. But viewers know very well, on many times we've asked you here, where your plan is long-term on social care. Now, you always said, oh, we've got to wait, but I promise you I'll come back with it any time. Now, your answer is now different, but it's we're going to have a plan by 2028. Now, do you admit it's a political choice to delay this? Were you just not able to persuade your colleagues in the Treasury and Downing Street that you had to get on with it right now? You've got a huge majority. You could have got on with it.
Well, that's not quite right, Laura, because in the last 6 months, what have we done on social care? We've legislated within the first 100 days for the first ever fair pay agreements to tackle the workforce crisis. The budget delivered the biggest expansion of carers allowance to support family carers, the biggest expansion since the 1970s. The budget boosted the spending power of local authorities and ring-fence funding specifically for social care.
But if you speak to anyone in the social care sector, they will tell you that the crisis is now. They will tell you also the budget has made life harder because they've got increased minimum wage and they've got to pay NI and national employers on their staff. Why wait until 2028 to come up with your long-term plan? We know you care about this issue. Why on earth is it going to take so long? Action
is needed now. That's why just this week I announced £86 million through the Disabled Facilities Grant to provide nearly 8,000 home adaptations right now. And as for the Casey Commission, look, I'm delighted, by the way. We've got one of Whitehall's best-known doers and social reformers to lead this commission. That should reassure people this isn't going to be some talking shop. We'll deliver action. The first report actually reports next year. And that will set out the actions we need to take on social care throughout this Parliament, not some point in the future. But I just take people back to, well, why take time a bit on the long-term plan? What I am trying to do is break the cycle of broken politics on this issue so we can actually build the kind of consensus for a national care service of the kind we've largely had on the National Health Service for the last 76 years, because our experience has been every general election campaign has been an election campaign where social care plans go to die. Ask Andy Burnham and Gordon Brown what happened to them in 2010.
The question for you now,
ask Theresa May what happened to her in 2017.
Louise Casey says the social care system, in order to work, needs much more money. Will you say that should be in the next Labour manifesto?
Well, I think what Louise will come up with as a reformer is a plan and a set of options on both reform, and she'll be clear about the investment that's needed. And what we want to do, which is why cross-party talks will be starting next month, is build national consensus on this so it doesn't become a party political football. And the final thing I'd say is not just actually to you, and you've as a journalist, you bang the drum harder on social care than many others.
So our viewers are on your case.
Just to say to your viewers about the challenge you put to us as politicians, of course we have to act now, and we're doing a lot now, and I promise we'll be doing more over the course of the next year. But don't always drag us to the short term. Don't try and torpedo the approach that says we want to build a national consensus and we want to try and stop social care being a party political football, because that's what's done for social care for generations. Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem and SNP-led governments have all failed on social care. Wouldn't it be amazing if we can work together to put it right? That's the approach Louise Casey and I are taking. I'm excited about it. I think the country should be too. But in the meantime, we've done a lot in the last 6 months. There's a hell of a lot more to do, and we won't be waiting until 2028 to get on. The first Casey Commission report will be next year, setting out the actions we'll be taking in this Parliament.
OK, well, Secretary said we must leave it there. But as you know, as you've said, our viewers will be on your case on this. But it's always great to have you with us in the studio this morning. As ever, as you have done on social care and all the other issues you do, let us know what's on your mind. You can email us, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or if you're a social media inclined kind of person, use the hashtag BBC Laura Kay. And the WhatsApp number, I promise I'll learn it off by heart by the end of the year. It's on the screen, 08000 282 161. And we'll try and hear some of your emails later in the show, or certainly in our newsletter on Friday. Well, Alan, let's come to you first. You've sat in that kind of chair on many times, many occasions. What did you make of what Wes Streeting had to say, first of all, about Elon Musk? Because he seemed to be saying he doesn't like it, but actually the government should sort of ignore it. He should back off, but he's not wanting to get into a big ruck.
If I was in that chair, I'd be saying exactly the same thing. It's the kind of thing that Lord Mandelson, for instance, has said, who's going to be our next ambassador in America. In government, you have to bring people together, not drive them apart. Now, Musk is a case in point. I mean, he wants to release Tommy Robinson and lock up Jess Phillips. I mean, many people would think that is too bizarre to even respond to. But for a government minister and for the Prime Minister, they have to consciously think about our diplomatic relations with the country that is one of our closest partners in trade and culture.
And do you think that is influencing how the government is handling this?
I think Wes went as far as he could to say that he's not in our position. We can say what we like. As far as he could as a cabinet minister. And the only thing I hope is when you talk to Chris, he doesn't step down into the gutter with Elon Musk and doesn't deny that Keir Starmer actually instigated the Rochdale inquiry. He is lauded by the prosecutor in the Northwest for actually leading the way in changing the CPS and changing the police in the way they deal with crimes against women. So I hope the Tories don't jump into that trough.
Well, Sam, then for your party, is there a risk that they have left a bit of a vacuum for Nigel Farage and his pal Elon Musk on this?
Well, I don't know. I think when it comes to independent inquiries, I've always been very apprehensive about the idea of just saying, yes, let's have one whenever something seems to have gone wrong.
Inquiry-itis.
Yeah, I mean, look, they're very expensive. The people that usually win are corporate law firms who charge exuberant fees. Very seldom do the victims get the closure that they're looking for. And also very seldom the recommendations are not implemented. And when they are, they don't always make the impact that is desired. I suppose that in this particular circumstance, on balance, I would say Jess Phillips probably should look at it again because, of course, every victim has had extremely bad experiences and some have actually died. The volume and the scale was very significant. And, of course, there was an inquiry, but the author of the independent inquiry has said that it was too narrow in scope.
But behind all of this, of course, are the Conservative and Labour too, but particularly Conservatives having real anxieties about the progress that Reform UK is making with the help of Elon Musk, with the help of all sorts of other things, using social media, Nigel Farage having these events all around the country. How do you think the Conservatives should handle that threat?
Yeah. I suppose there are two parts to that. The first is Reform are on the ascendancy, and they have one of the most consequential politicians of our time as its leader. And the Conservatives have a new leader who's not as well known, not as credible, not as big a political beast. And so it needs to be approached with great humility, in my view. I also, when I talk to Conservative colleagues, say, look at Keir Starmer. When he became leader of the opposition, he spent 4 or 5 years apologising for different things in different ways. And I think for the Conservatives, particularly in 2025, there needs to be a showing of genuine contrition. And also, and the second part of that is not always getting involved in every fight. And so when Nigel Farage and Elon Musk want to go toe-to-toe with Labour about a particular subject, it doesn't necessarily mean the Conservatives have to jump in. And I think the temptation to respond, particularly on X, when Nigel Farage says something needs to be curtailed, particularly Kemi in particular, my advice to her would probably be for 2025, give up your Twitter login, give it to your comms team.
Well, Chris Philp said that he would be spending less time on his phone, so maybe he was also implicitly trying to say that to her too. Let's then talk about the health service. So, Nicola, you're in touch with the experiences of thousands of nurses who are in hospitals and healthcare settings all around the country. The government's trying to show us what they say are big, bold reforms to the NHS, increasing choice, reforming the app. But from what you see, are the changes they want to make going to make that much difference?
We have to actually applaud this health secretary and the government to at least trying to tackle the challenges. And there's nothing that they've put forward that is difficult to disagree with, actually. Reform of social care, elective care as well as emergency. I listened very carefully to what Mr. Streeting said, and you absolutely have to agree with that. But there is a missing piece that I'm just not sure this government is focusing enough on.
What's that?
And that's the workforce. So if you want to have better care, you've got to have people to look after them. And the biggest workforce that is having the biggest challenge is nursing. Actually, we have still got 30,000 vacancies in nursing vacancies in England alone, 131,000 vacancies in social care. And actually nursing in this country is in a crisis, particularly in England.
But what's the answer to that, though? The public sector bodies have already, negotiated some pay increases for public sector workers. There's not much cash around. People are already being asked to pay more and more tax. What's the answer then? Because the government doesn't have a blank cheque to just entice more people into the profession who may well feel that they should be paid more, but that's not going to happen.
We have got to look at where we spend our money. And actually nursing staff in real terms since 2010, 2011 have their pay is reduced by 25%. We have absolutely got to entice people into the profession. It's an amazing job. I love the fact that I've been a nurse all my life, But actually the current circumstances of which many nurses are practicing is making them leave. And I'm having many, many direct contacts from nurses that are not proud of the care that they are currently giving and are really thinking of leaving. So we cannot afford, Laura, not to make nursing a priority.
Alan, you were Health Secretary as well as many of the other jobs that you did in government. How would you advise this government to try to grapple with this?
I think this is about individuals who are put in charge. I was there when we negotiated a party political consensus, Lib Dems, Conservatives, myself, what then became known as the tombstone tax, because Andrew Lansley broke the consensus.
When it came to
then you
social
had
care.
Boris Johnson coming into office saying, we've got a ready-made plan for adult social care. It didn't materialise. Then you had Theresa May, who, as Wes said, tried. She came forward with a plan. It got killed. That was called the dementia tax, if you remember.
I remember it well.
So you won't solve adult social care, going back to the question you asked Nicola, without money coming in from somewhere other than elsewhere in the NHS. That's part of the current problem. So it needs a new stream of money. The difference between Louise Casey, who's formidable, by the way, and Andrew Dilnot is Dilnot didn't have a terms of reference that said you also have to look not just at the recommendations, but how you're going to fund them. And that's crucial, and that can't be done overnight.
But that's fascinating. You said there that the money has to come from within the NHS. So you think that is the answer to social care? Find the cash in the health service, not come up with a new tax?
No, the other way around. Oh. They have to come up with a new stream of money from somewhere. Tombstone tax, dementia tax, whatever you want to call it. But don't say we need to sort out adult social care and then knock down every proposal that meaningfully looks to address it.
OK,
I completely agree with that. And I think that's where there has got to be some front loading. Up to a third of patients don't need to be in an acute hospital setting. And, you know, with district nurses seeing 25 patients a day.
OK, we must leave it there, but all three of you, thank you so much for now. And we'll definitely be returning to this issue, as I think Wes Streeting made perfectly clear. He knows that you care very much about what's happening with social care, so we will not forget that issue. Well, as we've talking about, Reform UK are definitely pitching themselves as the Conservatives' rivals, but the two parties do agree on one thing we've touched on too, the need for a new public inquiry to look at the so-called grooming gang scandal we've been talking about this morning. The Shadow Home Secretary is with us, Chris Philp. Let's then talk about this. So your leader and your party has been saying there should be another inquiry. But when you were in government, you denied the request for an inquiry, and your colleague, who was a minister at the time, actually wrote a letter, we can show it to viewers here, saying that it was up to local councils to do it, not for a national government to have another big investigation. And that letter was almost absolutely identical to the letter that Jess Phillips, who's now a Labour minister, wrote. And just I want to tell viewers, because I think we aren't able to show it, your colleague said it's for local authorities in individual towns and cities to commission local inquiries. So you're just playing politics with this now, aren't you?
No, Laura, that's not true. First of all, the previous request from Oldham only came from, I think, one or two individual councillors. The request that Jess Phillips denied was a formal request from the council. Secondly, at the time of that first letter you're referring to a couple of years ago, over 2 years ago, there was a national inquiry running, the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, that was looking at these issues in part, but not now, in our view, enough. What's also changed since then is that the grooming gangs task force that Rishi Sunak set up has led to over 500 arrests of gang rape perpetrators, but has also uncovered this problem has not finished. And that's why because of those reasons, that's why it's so important we now have a proper national statutory inquiry looking at all of this, including whether local authorities and the police and the Crown Prosecution Service properly investigated these appalling crimes, with young girls being the victims of organised gang rape, and indeed in some cases whether there was a cover-up. We've already heard Simon Danchuk, the former Labour MP for Rochdale, saying that the then chair of the Labour Party told him to cover this up and not refer to it because they were worried about losing Muslim votes. And that is morally bankrupt, and that needs to be investigated. The truth needs to come out.
And they're not there to answer that allegation. But what is pertinent to ask you today is, if this was so important to you, why, as a government, did you not follow up on the recommendations from the enormous independent inquiry led by Professor Alexis Jay that looked at this issue, made a long list of recommendations, and your government, when you were in charge, did not follow them up?
Well, I don't think that's true. The Grooming Gangs Task Force was established by Rishi Sunak in response to that report. And as I said a minute ago, let me finish, Laura.
Forgive me.
Let me finish.
No, I'm
over
afraid
500 arrests were made. And in addition to that, we were legislating when the election was called in the Criminal Justice Bill. And as it happens, I was the Bill Minister for that, introducing the obligation to report child sexual abuse. That was one of the main recommendations. It was in that bill that I was personally taking through Parliament when the election was called, and I call on the Labour government now to reintroduce that measure.
It's very important that viewers understand that the author of that inquiry has said publicly that she is concerned that as a government you did not follow up on the long list of recommendations on this very issue that she produced. As you say, there were some measures that were being done, but not all of them. And when you look at the evidence on this, you turned down an inquiry before. You didn't follow up on all of the recommendations from the inquiry that did take place. And yet this week, suddenly, when Reform UK and Elon Musk have started calling for a public inquiry again, you say, yes, it looks like pretty blatant politicking on one of the most sensitive issues in the country.
No, that's nonsense. It was a Conservative Home Secretary, Theresa May, who initiated the original inquiry in 2014 into Rotherham. It was a Conservative Home Secretary, again Theresa May, who set up the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. It was Sajid Javid, a Conservative Home Secretary, who commissioned a report into the data, establishing that many of these gang rape perpetrators were from Pakistani heritage. It was a Conservative Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who set up the Grooming Gangs Task Force, which led to over 500 arrests. So that is the record in government. But I'm going to be honest, that's not enough. We need more. We now have people like Simon Danczuk admitting that the Labour Party chairman at the time instructed him to cover these things up. And that is why we need a national public inquiry to get to the truth. And that is clearer now than ever. And I think it is shocking that Jess Phillips, the Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, and I presume by extension the Prime Minister are refusing to back this public inquiry. The public deserve the truth. The victims, who, let's not forget, are young, vulnerable girls who were gang raped in an organised way. Local councils actively covered this up. The police didn't investigate properly. It is a disgrace. We took a lot of measures before, but they're not enough. We need to go further.
OK. Do you think that Elon Musk's increasingly inflammatory social media posts about British politicians accusing them of being complicit in rape cross the line?
So I think he is obviously right to be raising the general issue because, as I've said already, vulnerable young girls were being gang raped. I think some of the specific language used about Jess Phillips is not appropriate. But raising the issue, as he has done generally, I think is reasonable because vulnerable young girls were let down by the system and public bodies, particularly local councils, often almost entirely Labour-controlled, covered this up for decades.
What about the language used by your colleague yesterday, Robert Jenrick, who's the Shadow Justice Secretary? He wrote online yesterday, "We imported hundreds of thousands of people from alien cultures who possess medieval attitudes towards women." But to many people watching this morning, that might just sound not just inflammatory, but actually like he's trying to stir up division. Would you use those words?
I haven't personally used those words.
Would
but
you?
Clearly, no. But clearly, what he is referring to, reasonably, is the fact that there were organised gangs of men, mainly from Pakistani heritage, we need to just be honest about that, were over many years abusing in an organised way vulnerable young girls, and that is completely unacceptable. It was covered up. It's a disgrace, and the truth needs to come out.
And everybody watching would absolutely condemn what happened. But do politicians have a responsibility to talk about this in a calm way, rather than the kind of language that you've just said you would not use, that we saw from your colleague Robert Jenrick yesterday?
Yeah, so politicians do have an obligation to do that, but they also have an obligation to tell the truth. And I think, Robert was highlighting this really important issue. He was right to do that. And in the past, concerns about, racism or cultural sensitivity or whatever you want to call it, meant this issue where young girls were being systematically raped was covered up because of these sensitivities. Now, that is completely wrong. It's morally bankrupt, and we need to be able to honestly and openly have these conversations. Robert is entirely entitled to raise this issue as he did. We need to be open and honest with the public about this in a way that didn't happen in the past, and frankly, protecting these vulnerable young girls who are getting gang raped. That is more important than cultural sensitivity, to be honest.
And of course, everybody watching would want to remember that victims, of course, are at the heart
That's
of
right.
what happened and
That's
should be
right.
at the foremost of everybody's thoughts. Thank you so much, Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp. It's great to have you with us in the first week of 2025. Although canny viewers might remember you were with us just before Christmas too. It's always good to have you here. Thank you very much indeed. Well, let's go back to our panel as we come to the closing moments of our first show of 2025. And we've talked about all sorts of things, but particularly about what has been going on this beginning of the year, this strange situation, you described it as, Alan, where you've got Elon Musk trying to intervene in UK politics in such a way. Are you concerned that this year might end up being sort of maybe even nastier and more divisive than the last few years in politics?
I am. I'm not someone who thinks social media has been a huge step forward for humanity, by the way. And I'm not surprised that someone who owns the biggest social media company in the world should use it in the way that some of the keyboard warriors use it. Actually, it reminds me of these people who shoot off something late at night. The important thing was your interrogation of Nigel Farage, who's been around a long time. We all know Nigel. He's an old-school Tory. And he wants to attract money and he wants to attract political attention. Nothing wrong with that in a democracy. The thing that kept going through my mind, yes, freedom of speech is important. Truth is important. Truth. And you heard Chris actually there mention truth, but wheedle his way around this gutter politics because he couldn't answer your question. Why did you only raise this after a £200 million 7-year national inquiry? As he rightly said, his Prime Minister instigated. Why have you only raised this now when Elon Musk says we should release Tommy Robinson and lock up Jess Phillips? He's getting into bed with some very nasty people. And it'll end in tears. OK,
well, briefly then, we're almost out of time, but let's have some New Year's resolutions for the year. Samuel, what should the Conservatives' New Year's resolution be?
I mean, my blood is boiling because of what Robert Jenrick said. I don't think that Elon Musk or Nigel Farage are the most dangerous individuals in our country. I think Robert Jenrick has the potential to be the most divisive person in our political history. I think some of his words over the last 12 months may result in some people maybe even dying, because he has the potential to incite hatred in ways that I have never seen. Nigel Farage,
saying that about someone in your own
Robert
party.
Jenrick, Nigel Farage, he talks about the things that many people in our country care about, and he articulates himself in a way that sometimes I don't like, but actually he doesn't cross the line. Robert Jenrick regularly crosses the line.
And we should say he's not here to defend himself,
and he
but it's
probably should come next week and maybe
try
and justify some of the words that he has been using recently. Completely inappropriate, uncalled for, unjustifiable and wrong. He needs to tone it down, and he needs to do that soon, or else we're going to have a really terrible 2025 in this country.
OK, and Nicola, we're closing seconds of the show. New Year's resolution for you?
To try and get the public and this government to value nursing. It's the key to everything that they do.
Well, we certainly value having you with us in the studio for the first time. It's been great to have you. Great to have you back, Samuel and Alan. Great to have you too, as ever. Thank you so much for getting us off to a start of 2025. And thank you, of course, always, most to you for being back with us and spending your Sunday morning with us. Now, a reminder, lots of the country have woken up to heavy snow. There are still 8 amber weather warnings in place, and there will be travel disruption on the roads and rails. And we've just had warnings that heavy rain and melting snow in southern England, that was quick, might even lead to some flooding. Some people, though, have been having fun with this. This video sent by Frankie Marcos, skiing in Surrey, it seems to be. I don't think I've ever seen that before in my life. One way to get around. But of course, stay across the BBC for everything that you need to know if you have to be out and about or staying safe and cosy at home. Keir Starmer will be back on your screens tomorrow talking about the health service. And in the next few weeks, hopefully he will join us, as well as Kemi Badenoch and Ed Davey. Of course, also, it's only a fortnight until Donald Trump's going to be sworn back into the White House. So strap yourself in for another year. We'll be with you every Sunday. I look forward to seeing you next week. Same time, same place.